we have Chiron that has moved into the sign of Taurus. Chiron is an asteroid. It is, in mythology, it is a centaur. It represents the wounded healer. In mythology, was a magical healer that had the ability to bring healing to all of those around them, but was wounded as well. And it required a particular type of magic to be able to heal that wound, right? And that is essentially the message of Chiron. And every single human being out there has Chiron somewhere in your natal birth chart. Chiron is present. Wherever it is placed in your chart can point to the core wound that you struggle with. We are oftentimes not aware or cognizant that this wound exists, at least not to the extent and the depth at which it operates in our life. You have this placement somewhere. If you are someone such as myself, who was born between May 28th, 1976 and April 10th, 1984, then you have Chiron in Taurus. There was a very brief window of time there between the end of 1983, the very end of the year. For the most part, during that window, have Chiron in Taurus. That makes this conversation 100-fold more important if you have that placement, because that means you will be experiencing a Chiron return sometime between today and 8 years into the future. That is a pivotal, life-changing moment whenever that occurs. And this 8-year cycle offers you the unique opportunity to heal. Not only to heal, but to prove that you have the medicine, the magic necessary to heal your wound, and then step into the highest possible version of yourself as the healer. Because then you have this medicine, not just for yourself, but to share with the world. What does it mean when Chiron transits Taurus, like what is happening today? Taurus is the proverbial earth sign. It is fixed earth. It is immovable, unchanging, fixed, right? So it represents the earth itself. It represents foundations, the root. It represents your values, your worth. Most astrologers, when talking about Chiron and Taurus, talk a lot about finances, about wealth, about financial stability, debts, and those sorts of things. That is a frequent result of Chiron and Taurus, but it is not. It's not the cause. It's more like the effect of Chiron and Taurus, because of the foundation, the stability, the root, right? The value, the worth. If you boil money and financial security down to its root, what that really means for you, what we're really talking about is your ability to have your needs met, right? Chiron and Taurus ultimately is about the realization, sometimes unexpected, sometimes painful, that certain things we have taken for granted, that we will always have food on our table, that the job will be there, that we will have enough to pay our bills, and that our needs will always be met, that we have autonomy inside of our own body, and that the world is generally a safe place. Those assumptions can frequently be challenged whenever you have Chiron and Taurus, because you are bringing the wound to the area of fixed earth. At the very core essence of Chiron and Taurus, if I was to boil this down to one thing, I would say Chiron and Taurus ultimately represents a feeling of safety within your own body. And I'm speaking from experience here, that my go-to move with astrology is to turn to the past, to study history, because history repeats itself in cycles, and astrology gives us a map of those cycles. So essentially, roughly every 50 years, Chiron transits around the zodiac and comes back into Taurus. And about every 50 years during that cycle, a pattern emerges. So what I want to do now is I want to talk about the last cycle, the last time Chiron was in Taurus, and look very closely at the way those energies manifested into our reality, the way life changed for millions of people during that 8-year period of time. Even if you were not alive then you won't remember this, but it becomes very important to understand the cycle and understand the pattern of how these energies present themselves in the world. Because if we look at enough of these cycles, you'll begin to see, hey, all of these things seem to be repeating themselves, right? And then we can say, this is a good idea of what we have coming to look forward to in the next 8 years. From May 28th, 1976 until April 1984. First, this is not about fear. This is not to cause negativity. It's not to cause you to doubt or fear the future. If you notice your energy shifting in that direction, take a moment to ground yourself, center yourself, and take a few deep breaths in, and remember, this is about understanding. It's about understanding the energies in the cycle so that we can meet it appropriately. Chiron is never just about the wound. It's never punishment. It's never the universe trying to make us go through terrible, horrendous things and punishing us just for the fun of it. It is there to teach us something. It is there to lead us to the medicine. Every single cycle that we will talk about over the coming years, every single one of them, there is a medicine that is found in that cycle that heals the wound for those who are willing to do the work and put that medicine to work. So there's a lot of ground to cover on this cycle. From May 28th, 1976 to April 1984, a lot happened. Several of you were alive then. Some of you may have been adults during that period of time. Some of you were just born or were young children. But most of us that are here right now went through this last cycle. And that's why I'm starting there instead of 500 years ago. So the backdrop of Chiron moving into Taurus in the last cycle, pre-1976, is this was a period of rising inflation. The world was in a little bit of a precarious situation, and we had been in the United States, we had been experiencing the Cold War with the Soviet Union sometime. Inflation had started to rise, right? And there was a few things that occurred before Chiron entered Taurus that triggered a little bit of almost a domino effect geopolitically. One of the most interesting things that you might notice some similarities between this cycle and our current cycle today is that towards the beginning of this period, there was the Iranian Revolution in Iran, right? The government was overthrown. There was a revolution. And that led to a serious reduction in oil production out of Iran, which accounted for at least 10% of the global supply, which does not sound like a lot, but it was enough to trigger distribution issues globally. And those effects were felt all over. In the United States, several of the states began regulating when you could get gas and who could get gas. Many fuel stations adjusted their hours because of this, because of the demand was higher than the supply. And so they reduced their hours. They would open late and they would close early. Gas stations started seeing lines that were in some cases miles long. Sometimes people ran out of gas and were standing in these lines holding gas jugs, waiting for their turn to get gas. And in certain of these states, you could only get gas on certain days based on even and odd numbers of your license plate registration. This wasn't universal. It wasn't the entire United States, but several key states had to do this because of the gas shortages. And the prices, as you can imagine, went way up compared to where they were. At the same time, so we've had this restructuring of Iran. We had a disruption to the global oil supply, and then we've seen the effects of that, right? At a time where we were already in a period of rising inflation in the United States. And then we had the Iranian hostage crisis, where several Americans were kidnapped and held hostage for 444 days, if I'm not mistaken. This was a big deal for anybody who was alive during then. You probably remember hearing about this and seeing it on the news. Almost every single day, front page news. It was the first thing all of the stations were talking about. You can imagine that for those Americans who were kept hostage by Iran, they were going through it, right? They probably did not feel that they had a whole lot of autonomy, a sense of safety within themselves. And their family members probably did not either. So we went from rising inflation to a period that is referred to as stagflation during this period of time on the heels of these events we've already talked about. And then at the same time this is occurring, we had massive layoffs. Unemployment rates began to skyrocket. We had the farm crisis. Some of you might remember that. This was a huge deal. Many massive generational farms. People who had been farming for generations and generations, they were told, you've got to get bigger. You've got to produce more grain, more wheat, more corn, more soy, more all of it, right? Because America was feeding much of the world. The biggest importer of American grains at that time was the Soviet Union. They had to have that. And their demand was greater than our supply. So key officials told these farmers, look, you've got to ratchet it up. We've got to produce more. And so pressure was put on these farmers, many of who were young, third or fourth generation farmers. And the only way to scale up was to get more land, right? And so they were told, look, this is an excellent investment. Land never drops in value. It will only go up. You're already pretty leveraged, but look, we will go buy this 500 acres of land for you over here. And the payment you'll easily be able to make with these extra grain cells from what you're producing. And it'll just be a great investment. You'll pay it off in time. And eventually that 500 acres will be worth 10 times what it is now. You can't go wrong. So thousands and thousands of these farmers took the advice that they were given and bought tons and tons of land. And then Carter, I believe that it was, in response to growing tensions with the Soviet Union, who had attacked and was waging war in Afghanistan, in an attempt to punish that behavior, the U.S. administration boycotted the Soviet Union and said, you're no longer able to buy our grains, period. And so these farmers, thousands of farmers who had just put all of these extra debts on their books, had overextended themselves, were told, now 90% of the grain that you're producing cannot be sold. And then the values fell out. The bottom fell out of the grain market. And they couldn't give the stuff away, right? And the debts started piling up. Interest rates skyrocketed, over 21%. I don't know if you can even imagine that. As bad as it is currently, 21% interest rates. People could not afford to pay their debts any longer. And people started to lose the farm. And this wasn't just their livelihood, and it wasn't just their home. This was their inheritance of many generations of ancestral work, right? And so these people not only were losing their ancestral roots, their livelihood, and their inheritance, but they felt like they were letting down their entire lineage during this time. Banks started collapsing. There was run on banks. The banks didn't have the funds to cover it. Hundreds of banks insolvent and closed their doors. These farms were auctioned off for pennies on the dollar, and thousands of farmers lost everything, including the shirt on their back. So that was the farm crisis, right? Now, at the same time, there was an interesting phenomenon a little bit later on the timeline where elite members of society, especially within the financial districts, Wall Street, and financiers, started getting caught in fraud and embezzlement schemes. And these were the first time that these things had ever really been brought to light. There was a pastor of this church that was, I believe, the very first televangelist that had grown his estate to almost disgusting levels. He had a massive multi-million-dollar mansion, and they were creating these luxury resorts and selling shares in them, and had sold thousands and thousands of shares over their own capacity, all in the guise of this is what God wants you to do, to support this this message so that we can get the truth out to the world. And then after years of this, and many people, especially the elderly, donating their entire savings, their entire fortunes to this individual, it was discovered that many unscrupulous things were occurring. They were charged with fraud and imprisoned. And that same type of energy was present in almost every area of the elite, whether it was Hollywood, Wall Street, the financial districts, or televangelism. It was everywhere. Members of the elite were getting arrested, were getting charged with fraud. It was being discovered that while everyone was suffering in the worst depression since the Great Depression, people were seriously taking advantage of the population. The political backdrop of this entire cycle, from beginning to the end of it, was Reagan, Ronald Reagan, and Reaganomics. Again, there's an interesting similarity between the cycles there, between the presidency of Reagan and Donald Trump. No matter what you think of Trump, it is almost impossible not to see that he has modeled his entire policy and presidency after Ronald Reagan. He said as much. So Reagan was elected at the at a pivotal time in this cycle when inflation had already started to put the squeeze on Americans. Carter had already turned off the tap for grain sales to the Soviet Union. The farm crisis was already in full swing. So we were already in pretty precarious situations, right? Americans were in distress. We needed help. And a lot of Americans looked to the government and said, we need you to do something, right? And then in came a president who said, almost verbatim, the challenges that we're facing and the problems that we're facing cannot be solved by government. And that what we need to do is shrink the government and shrink discretionary spending and shrink entitlement spending and cut the taxes on the wealthy, the elite, the billionaire class. Cut their taxes. And then the proceeds will trickle down to all of the rest of you guys who are struggling and you're starving and you've lost your farms and you've lost everything, right? So at first he was not a very popular president because he came in saying those things in a very crucial moment in history. Relatively early on in his presidency, there was several strikes. Workers wrestled with this idea of values. What am I worth, right? The entire country is struggling to make ends meet because of the stagflation, because of rising costs of everything. And as an example, air traffic controllers went on strike, and they were demanding better work conditions, better salaries, higher pay, better benefits. And Ronald Reagan decided to take a stand on that. And he said, we absolutely will not tolerate terrorism, essentially. And he said, you're fired. And just like that, he fired 11,000 air traffic controllers at the drop of a hat. And he set the tone for many thousand other workers in different industries who were trying to stand up for their inherent value and demand that they be paid according to their value, because they felt like that they were being taken advantage of. And then they get this image of, well, this is what happens if you try to stand up and fight the system. Then the rug gets pulled out from under you. And maybe you should have just kept your mouth shut, because now you get nothing, right? So 11,000 people at the drop of a hat, just like that. He said, you're fired. And that set a very dangerous precedence at that time. All of this turmoil, the geopolitical unrest, the banks closing, the strikes, the stagflation, the farm crisis, the skyrocketing unemployment rate, people struggling to get their needs met. At the same time that the country and the rest of the world was dealing with these things and similar things, Americans were also dealing with the Cold War that had reared its ugly head once again, and tensions were at a high point. This had been going on for a long time, but during Chiron and Taurus, from that period of time, there was several key incidents that really ratcheted things up quite a bit, to where the vast majority of Americans, and on the other side, Soviets, believed that we were perhaps minutes or even seconds away from all-out nuclear war. There was not too many days that went by that wasn't on people's minds. And so that obviously is a manifestation of that feeling of safety that is a part of fixed earth, of the root, the foundation, right? And whenever that foundation, the root, is wounded, there is a feeling of instability, insecurity, not being safe, right? And if every day you wake up wondering if we're going to nuclear war, if the bomb's going to be dropped on us, you're not going to feel very safe, right? So that's the backdrop of dealing with all of the other stuff we've discussed. And now the big one, the biggest one in my mind, that was a direct manifestation of these energies, was the AIDS epidemic. This is one that is hard to talk about, and unless you were alive and likely an adult or teen during the early 1980s, this is something that's probably almost impossible to fully appreciate and understand. We all know today what AIDS is, what the HIV virus is. But it's important to know that wasn't always the case. Whenever the first cases were reported in San Francisco in the early, 1980, people started showing up to medical clinics, going to their doctor's office very sick. And the doctors had no idea what was going on. They had no answer for it whatsoever. All they knew is that case after case, hundreds of people started pouring in, and they had some mystery illness, some disease, and they didn't have long to live. Many of them came in and then a week later or a few days later were dead. And this was a terrifying period of time because they could not identify what was causing it. They didn't know what it was. They didn't know how it spread. All they knew is that there was a mystery disease out there that was taking lives. And it first started with a few cases, and within mere weeks, it was hundreds of cases a day, and then eventually thousands of cases at a time. And still no answers. Nobody knew. All they knew was that there was a pattern that was emerging. At first, it was within the homosexual community, associated with particular regions. And then it started to spread. And then it was everybody. And then it wasn't just the United States, then it was globally. And still we didn't have answers for what this was. Eventually, they figured out that it was sexually transmitted, except for the few cases where the blood supply had become contaminated, and anyone who had needed a blood transfusion was essentially exposed to this disease, and then they got it themselves. There was no answer for this. There was no cure. There wasn't even a treatment. And there was far more questions than there were answers. Early on, the only answers that we as a society had is that we knew this was sexually transmitted and that pretty much anybody could get it. And at that time, if you got it, it was a death sentence. So if you weren't alive and of an adult age during that period of time, try to imagine feeling that your natural human instinct of procreation brings on or initiates existential threat, right? What is more human than to procreate, right? That is the very heart of fixed Earth, to propagate the species, right? The body was wounded during this period of time that made people so afraid in their body. There was no feeling of safety in the body. Nobody felt safe during that time. And ultimately, this would go on to take millions of lives. There are still today more cases of AIDS than there ever has been. But luckily, there has been tremendous advancements, right, to where it's bordering on a cure, right? You can't say actually cure, but essentially, if properly treated, your life expectancy is essentially the same as anybody else. So that's a huge difference from what it was in the early 1980s, right? This was a death sentence for anybody who got it during that time. And it did not matter if you were rich or if you were poor, if you were affluent or if you were not. It did not matter. Everybody during that period of time started to feel like the world was not a safe place. That was a very powerful manifestation of Chiron in Taurus. For far too many people, almost everybody, it seemed, knew somebody that had come down with AIDS. People were dropping like flies. It was absolutely a pandemic. And the terrifying part early on is that we didn't have the answers. We didn't know, right? For the longest time, people didn't know if, as an example, how it was transmitted. So people didn't know if you could get it through kissing, if you could get it through touching, through being around somebody. And so there was this huge stigma around anybody who did contract this, where people just didn't want to be around you, right? Out of fear. They didn't want to have physical contact with you. They didn't even want to breathe around you for fear that maybe this was airborne. It's hard to really imagine what that was like. But there are some pretty serious parallels to today in recent days. I know I've just painted a pretty grim picture. First of all, I recommend, as always, for everyone to do their own research on this. And I think it would be a really good idea to look into that period of time from 1976 to 1984 however you want to. Of course, it's entirely up to you, right? I do sometimes like to assign homework. But what really helped me, of course, I'd done the research and, I'd done all of the digging around online. But what helped me more than anything was watching documentaries from that period of time, because there were aspects of this that I just was not aware of. I mean, I was born in early 1984, so I was born at the very tail end of this. I didn't live through it. And I'd known a lot of it, but I didn't understand the full scope and magnitude of how bad this was. This, in many, many ways, was 100 times worse than the 2007, 2008 housing market collapse. That was a big deal for a lot of investors, for the real estate industry, and for certain banks. But this 8-year period from 76 to 84 hit everyday people, everybody, right? Except for the ultra wealthy, the insanely rich. And it was the highest period of inflation, of unemployment, and just about every other metric you can look at since the Great Depression. And nothing has compared to it since then. It was a rough period of time. And again, it wasn't just the economics. It wasn't just the geopolitical instability. There was this day in and day out fear of, is the bomb going to drop? Is this person next to me going to give me this disease that could take my life? It was an overall feeling of not being safe in the world, not being safe in your body. Now let's talk about the medicine.